Hi Founders fans, Jason here, and today we're going to talk about the life of James Otis. Now, James Otis is one of those founders who caused the revolution and then had very little to do with it afterwards, and we're going to talk about why. So, Otis was a brilliant young man from Boston, excuse me, who went to Harvard, and when he graduated, he quickly became one of the most respected lawyers in his colony. Additionally, he was a fabulous speaker. And on top of that, since his family was wealthy, he was a leader of one of the sects of Boston's political system. And his major adversary his whole life was Thomas Hutchinson, who would actually go on to become governor of the colony of Massachusetts in the lead up to Revolution. He would be governor during, definitely during the Boston Tea Party. I think during the Boston Massacre, if not, then maybe shortly afterwards. Definitely shortly afterwards. So Hutchinson was involved with issuing what were called writs of assistance in the early 1760s, just after the French and Indian War ended. And these writs of assistance were permissions granted to certain people that they could just enter someone's home and look for evidence of a crime at will. You know, basically open-ended warrants on everyone. If this sounds bad, then you agree with James Otis, who said, no, not cool. And Otis, who had already been making a name for himself and had become friendly with Samuel Adams, who was already rabble-rousing a little bit, Otis was actually the first one to kind of push Adams, and later John Hancock and John Adams and Joseph Warren. Otis was really the first one speaking out publicly against British problems, and he even started doing this before the French and Indian War technically ended. And at one point, early in the 1760s, he gives a big speech, apparently a 5-hour speech about writs of assistance and how they're wrong, and references all this classical literature and natural rights. And that's when he makes a name for himself. And in the years following, he wrote several pamphlets which underscored issues that a decade later, 12, 13, 14 years later, when the revolution would start, they would reference James Otis's statements. Now, after some of the, and when the Stamp Act came out, some of the earlier aggressive taxes began, but most notably the Stamp Act started promoting the stamp tax. Otis was one of the big proponents saying this is not acceptable, and he was really the major driving force behind the calling of the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in 1765. And I've said before on this channel, from my perspective, the Stamp Act Congress is really the beginning of the American Revolution. Not the Revolutionary War, of course, that wouldn't start for another 10 years. But the Stamp Act Congress is the first time that delegates of other colonies come together in one united group. There are some earlier examples. Ben Franklin's Albany Conference, 10 years before that, but it was for different reasons. This was the first time they were coming together to complain to Great Britain about Great Britain. So Otis goes there. He's a leader in it, but this is before Patriots and Loyalists were really a thing. But there were some super loyalists in there who were sent in. I believe the gentleman's name was Timothy Riggles. They were specifically sent to slow down this organization. That being said, they did end up, this is the first time people like John Dickinson and John Rutledge and Caesar Rodney and many future founders all met each other for the first time in the first room and started working together. And a lot of the onus on that falls on Otis. I didn't mean to make that rhyme. And onus has negative connotations, so maybe I shouldn't use that word. But so James Otis is the driving force behind the Stamp Act Congress, and it is a humongously important few days in New York for the history of the United States of America. Unfortunately, after that, Otis, he's begun making some enemies, especially with some of the tax collectors coming to town, and there was one gentleman named John Robinson who was one of the tax collectors, and he apparently wrote some letters back to England that were saying, hey, like, this James Otis guy is no good. And word got back to Otis that this was going on. So Otis first writes in the paper an article slandering this guy. Just slandering him. It wasn't necessarily the best way to go about it. But then a few days later, he goes into a local coffee house and he goes into a coffee house that's full of loyalists, more or less. Again, they weren't really called loyalists yet, but British soldiers would go to this coffee house. Tax collectors were drinking coffee in this coffee house. This is not really Otis's crowd. And he goes in and he demands a duel. He wants satisfaction. So he goes in and demands a duel, and Robinson basically allegedly grabs him by the nose, and they throw him outside, and Robinson and his buddies all beat the daylights out of Otis, with British officers just sitting there watching. So this event is significant for two reasons. First of all, it's just another in a chain of, like, the British government doing whatever they want right in front of officers who are supposed to protect the citizens. That's their job. Here's a citizen getting beat up by an official. Well, to be fair, Otis was in the Colonial Assembly, so it was an official beating up another official, but still, not acceptable. But more importantly is Otis is, like, really hurt. John Adams, who was a big Otis fan, who really got into the revolution because of hearing Otis speak and always looked up to Otis, Adams even said there was, like, you could put your finger in a hole in his head months later. Like, not an acceptable. There are lines. Once you win the fight, you stop. I mean, okay, I guess that's me personally. Not that I'm a big fighter. I'm an old man. But it's no laughing matter, because Otis, after this event, began suffering seriously from mental illness, where he would kind of lose where he was. He would make weird claims. Sometimes he'd go back and say, I wish I never went against the British. Then he'd go right back and say they're terrible. He'd go in and out of lucidity. And a lot of people like to say that it was this event that gave him mental illness, but there are a few writings of people like John Adams that do hint that he was already having some mental problems before this event. You know, like, the idea that he went into this situation doesn't necessarily help his cause. But there is no doubt that this significantly pushed him further over the edge. And from there, and this is in 1769, so this is 5 years before the First Continental Congress. So he really, because of this, does not play a role in the American founding. Except, of course, being the major proponent behind the Stamp Act Congress, which was a huge, as I said before, a gigantic step towards revolution. And for that reason, Otis does belong in our conversation. That's why I'm bringing him up here. He does belong in the pantheon of American founders, but he's not there for the founding, like, at all. It's not even like we're talking about a Joseph Warren who died at Bunker Hill very early on, or an Edmund Peyton Randolph. I think I'm thinking of Edmund Randolph. I think I'm thinking of Edmund Randolph, who was the first president of the Continental Congress, but died well before anything went down. No, this is a guy who was still alive for most of the war. He had just lost his mind. And because of that, he was fairly intentionally pushed aside by some of his comrades, the John Adamses and Sam Adamses and John Hancocks, Joseph Warrens. They pushed, I mean, he had lost his mind. They loved him. He was a friend of theirs, but there was only so much they can do. So he actually spent most of the rest of his life out in the countryside, in and out of lucidity. And then, very interestingly, there is a quote here I'd like to read that I, of course, clicked off of like a dummy from Otis. He had told his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, who I will definitely make another video about, he said, "My dear sister, I hope, when God Almighty in his righteous providence shall take me out of time into eternity, that it will be by a flash of lightning. And what's interesting about that is he's basically saying, when I die, I hope I get struck by lightning. Weird thing to say, but he had lost his mind. But interestingly enough, in 1783, right a few months before the victory at Yorktown, James Otis is standing on his porch and he is struck by lightning. And that is how he died. I mean, at that point he was 58 years old, but he had also lost his mind almost 15 years before that. So, sad ending. It's a really important founder, a super interesting founder, and I hope you enjoyed learning about him. But even though he's very interesting, his story does take a sad turn. But again, James Otis, from a very important revolutionary family, was a very important pre-revolutionary. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe. Feel free to share it on any social media you like with anyone you think might also enjoy it. I'm going to get out of here for the weekend, and I will be back to you on Monday. Thank you.